July 28, 1943. The skies over Germany were a different world, a world where the roar of engines, the flashes of machine gun fire, and the hum of bombers filled the air. For the men of the Allied air forces, this was a daily reality. But that day, for the crew of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress named Lady Luck, the reality would be different. The plane was carrying its crew over the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, ready for another bombing raid, another attempt to cripple the Nazi war machine. But what they didn't know was that they were about to be faced with one of the most terrifying situations of their lives, a situation that would require every ounce of courage and resourcefulness they had. As the crew climbed higher into the clouds and set course toward the target, the familiar drone of the four engines filled the cockpit, a sound that had become as reassuring as anything could be in the chaos of war. Inside the cockpit, Flight Officer Jack Thompson adjusted the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. He had flown hundreds of missions already, and while the risk was always high, there was an unspoken confidence in the crew, confidence born from months of training and countless hours in the air. Lady Luck had become a trusted companion. "Clear skies ahead, Captain," Thompson's co-pilot, Sergeant William "Bill" Haskins, reported, his voice calm but with an edge of nervous excitement. Bill had been flying with Thompson for over a year now. They had seen each other through narrow escapes, close calls, and battles with enemy fighters. But today was different. Thompson nodded. "Good. Keep an eye on the instruments. We don't want any surprises." The crew of Lady Luck had been briefed on their target, a Nazi military installation deep in occupied Europe. German factories were the backbone of Hitler's war effort, and the Allies knew that to win, they would need to destroy those factories, cutting off supplies and crippling the enemy's ability to fight. But what they didn't know was that this would be no ordinary raid. This time, the enemy would not only strike back with anti-aircraft fire, but also with the most formidable fighters in the sky. The Luftwaffe was waiting for them. As the bomber formation began to close in on their target, the first signs of trouble appeared on the horizon. A group of German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters rose from the ground below, their sleek forms cutting through the clouds with terrifying speed. The roar of their engines, the unmistakable sound of enemy fighters, shattered the relative peace in the cockpit of Lady Luck. "Here they come!" yelled Gunner Sergeant Henry Hank Lawson, his hand tightening around the machine gun controls as the German fighters sped toward them. He had seen this happen before, but it never lost its intensity. The pilots of the Messerschmitts were ruthless, trained to destroy anything that came into their sights. "Stay steady, men!" Thompson's voice came through the intercom, calm but firm. He knew the routine. Flying in formation with bomber escorts was one of the safest ways to complete a raid. But today, there were too many fighters, too much pressure from the enemy. And then, the unimaginable happened. A sudden jolt shook the entire aircraft, a violent shudder that rattled the frame of the B-17 and caused every crew member to brace instinctively. For a second, it felt like time itself had frozen. The aircraft's engine suddenly cut out, the whine of the turbines died, and the once thrumming power of the Boeing B-17 was silenced. One of the four engines had failed. "What the hell?" Thompson muttered, his hands gripping the controls tightly. His mind raced. In a moment, the landscape around him had shifted from one of controlled chaos to near catastrophe. One engine down could mean disaster. A bomber was already a sitting duck, but without the power to stay airborne or keep up speed, Lady Luck was even more vulnerable. They were already deep in enemy territory, and without the full complement of working engines, the crew was sitting at the mercy of the Luftwaffe and the deadly firepower of the German fighters. "Engine 2 is gone, Captain," Bill Haskins shouted, his eyes glued to the gauges. He quickly assessed the situation. The engine on the port side was dead. The B-17 was now running on just 3 engines, and at such an altitude, it was going to be a challenge to keep the plane in the air for long. Thompson's heart sank as he scanned the horizon. The German fighters were closing in rapidly, their deadly presence adding another layer of urgency. But even more pressing was the reduced power in their aircraft. They were now sitting ducks, unable to escape and vulnerable to attack. "Can we get it back?" Thompson asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Negative, sir," Bill replied. "The engine's completely gone. We're down to 3. We've got to get out of here, or we're sitting ducks." There was a brief silence on the radio. Every man on that bomber knew the reality they faced. The B-17, though a fortress in its own right, was not invincible. The German fighters were closing in, and without the full speed and maneuverability of the aircraft, the crew was in a life-or-death situation. Thompson knew that their best option was to try to make it back to England, but with one engine down, the chances of returning were slim, even slimmer with the incoming fighters. "Get the gunners ready!" Thompson barked. "We're going to have to fight our way through. Stay sharp, men. We're not giving up today." As Thompson took control of the plane, steering it toward a more defensive angle, the reality set in. They were outnumbered, underpowered, and in hostile airspace. The German fighters were fast, and with every second, they were getting closer. But then, something unexpected happened. The broken engine, while limiting their speed, actually played an important role in their survival. As the German fighters zeroed in on them, Lady Luck's pilots used the reduced speed to their advantage. The slower flight path made it more difficult for the Messerschmitts to target them, forcing the enemy pilots to make sharper, more desperate moves in their attacks. The bombers' slower speed created a kind of tactical advantage. "They're hesitating. They're not sure how to engage us," Hank Lawson shouted from the back, his eyes on the German fighters as they circled. The crew realized that they had something the Luftwaffe didn't expect: resilience. While the loss of an engine should have meant certain death, it turned the tables in a way that no one anticipated. The broken engine, though it had turned their mission into a fight for survival, unexpectedly gave Lady Luck's crew a small but crucial advantage. The B-17 Flying Fortress was limping, but it wasn't giving up. Its remaining 3 engines sputtered against the wind, but the crew, though under tremendous pressure, rallied around the one thing they had: each other. Flight Officer Jack Thompson, ever the calm and calculated leader, fought to keep the aircraft steady. He had flown hundreds of sorties, and he had seen bombers go down under far less peril. This, however, was different. The broken engine had not only limited their power, but had forced the crew into unfamiliar territory, a battle they hadn't trained for. Every decision had to count. The German fighters, mostly Messerschmitt Bf-109s, circled above them like sharks, closing in on a wounded prey. They were fast, precise, and ready to tear apart any Allied aircraft in their sights. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't anticipate, was how this wounded B-17, this struggling aircraft, could still put up a fight. "Enemy fighters on the approach. They're coming in from all directions." Sergeant Henry Hank Lawson, the rear gunner, barked over the radio. The B-17's gunners had been ready, their machine guns trained on every inch of the sky. But with one engine out, maneuvering was slower, and the odds were now heavily stacked against them. Still, Lawson's voice carried a sense of determination. "Stay steady, Hank. We'll make it through this." Thompson responded, his grip tightening on the controls as he adjusted the B-17's flight path. "We're not out of options yet." The aircraft's remaining engines were still working, though barely, and Thompson focused on maintaining speed just high enough to keep the Mi-10-9s at bay, knowing that any sudden maneuver could cause the plane to stall. But the B-17, built like a fortress, could take damage. It was designed to absorb punishment, to withstand the worst that war could throw at it. Yet, even the mighty Boeing B-17 had limits. The next few minutes would test those limits. Gunner Sergeant Hank Lawson had already picked up on a crucial change in the way the German fighters were attacking. They hesitated. Normally, they would swoop in from above or below, quickly making their kills. But now, the German pilots were pulling back slightly, unsure of how to approach a wounded bomber that was not acting like the easy prey it should have been. "They're not used to this, Captain," Lawson shouted from the back. "They don't know how to approach us. We're not flying as we should, but that's working in our favor." Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked over his shoulder, watching the German Messerschmitts make erratic moves. Lady Luck's slower speed, the result of the one dead engine, was creating an unexpected challenge for the Luftwaffe pilots. They were used to taking down bombers quickly, with their superior speed and maneuverability. Now they had to think twice. The slower pace meant they had to adjust, riskier attacks to outmaneuver the B-17, and that hesitation made them vulnerable. Lady Luck wasn't finished just yet. "Keep firing, Hank. We've got this," Thompson barked. The B-17's gunners, fully aware of the gravity of the situation, didn't need to be told twice. Sergeant Lawson and his fellow gunners opened fire, their .50 caliber machine guns lighting up the sky with tracer rounds. It wasn't just about taking down German fighters, it was about disrupting their attacks, forcing them to rethink their strategy. The first wave of fighters swooped in for another pass, and Thompson pushed the throttles, leaning into the controls to keep the bomber steady. Mi-109S dived down on them, their engines howling as they locked onto the vulnerable bomber. "I've got one on my tail," shouted Sergeant George Red Kennedy, the tail gunner. He could see the Mi-109 closing in fast, and his heart raced as he prepared to fire. "Steady, Red, steady," Thompson shouted, his voice tight but commanding. The crew was working in unison now, pushing the aircraft to the limits. Then a burst of tracer fire from the tail guns lit up the sky. Kennedy's rounds found their mark, and the Mi-10-9, trailing them, exploded in a burst of fire. The German fighter spiraled out of control, plummeting to the earth below. "Got one, Captain!" Kennedy yelled, barely able to keep the excitement from his voice. He had just made an incredible shot. But he knew this was far from over. The skies were still full of enemy fighters. But there was no time to rest. Thompson could hear the rapid fire of the German guns as they approached again. The Mi-109s had regrouped and were coming in for another run. "We need to get some altitude," Thompson ordered. The B-17's engines struggled to push the bomber higher, but the reduced power of the three remaining engines wasn't enough. The Mi-109s were closing in, their tactics growing more aggressive. But then, something strange happened. The Mi-109s seemed to pull back again. Their attacks weren't as coordinated as before, and their hesitation was palpable. They were unsure of how to approach this wounded bomber. "What's going on? Why aren't they finishing us off?" Bill Haskins, the co-pilot, asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I think they're confused, Bill," Thompson replied. "The dead engine is throwing them off. They're used to hitting us hard and fast, but now they're uncertain." The German fighters had been so used to bombing and strafing without resistance. They had always counted on the superior speed of their aircraft. But Lady Luck had thrown a wrench in their plans. It was no longer an easy kill. The crew had reduced the target's vulnerability by fighting back, by taking advantage of the enemy's confusion. The hesitation was turning the battle into an unexpected standoff. The Mi-10-9s, now aware that this wasn't the usual B-17, began to break off their attacks, one by one. They knew they couldn't sustain the assault without putting themselves at risk. The Lady Luck was still alive, still dangerous, and still firing back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the remaining German fighters veered off, leaving the Lady Luck and its crew behind. "We did it," Thompson muttered, his voice low with relief. His hands, still gripping the controls, were steady now, but his heart was still racing. The German planes were gone. The B-17, though battered and limping, had survived. Against all odds, against every expectation, the crew had made it through. But this battle wasn't over. They still had to get back to England. "We're not out of the woods yet, men," Thompson said, but there was a quiet pride in his voice. "Let's get this bird home." The Lady Luck limped through the skies, her 3 remaining engines struggling to maintain altitude as she veered off from the battlefield. The deafening sound of enemy fire had receded, replaced by the unsettling hum of the damaged aircraft. Jack Thompson held the controls tightly, his knuckles white from the strain. The crew, battle-worn and weary, exchanged looks of exhaustion, but there was a quiet determination in their eyes. They had survived the initial onslaught, but they weren't safe yet. "How much further to base?" asked Bill Haskins, the co-pilot, his voice strained but steady. His fingers were working the radios, trying to re-establish contact with Allied command. "We've got a long way to go, Bill. We've still got to clear enemy territory, and with 1 engine down, it's going to be tough." Thompson's voice was sharp, focused. He wasn't about to let the crew give up. Not after everything they had just been through. The German fighters had been repelled, but their attacks had forced Lady Luck into a dangerous situation. With 1 engine out, the bomber was far less maneuverable, and the chances of making it back to base on just 3 engines were slim. Every second felt like an eternity. The Allied forces had been counting on these bombers to return home with vital intelligence about the enemy, but it seemed like their luck had run out. The sky was beginning to darken, and the crew could see the English coastline in the distance. But they weren't just facing the danger of enemy aircraft anymore. The weather was turning, thick clouds swirling as a storm began to form. The weakened B-17, burdened with the damage from the attack and now fighting the wind and rain, was hardly in a condition to brave what lay ahead. "Captain, the fuel gauge is getting low," reported Sergeant Lawson, the rear gunner. His sharp eyes were on the instruments, tracking the decreasing fuel reserves. "We've got enough for the final stretch, but not much more. Keep an eye on it, Lawson. We'll make it back." Thompson's voice was firm, but his heart was racing. He had been in many tight situations before, but this was different. They were behind enemy lines, dangerously low on fuel, and with 1 engine down, the chances of making it back were rapidly decreasing. The storm continued to close in, and Thompson's focus was unwavering as he navigated the treacherous skies. Every decision, every adjustment to the controls mattered. The wind and rain hammered against the bomber, making it harder to maintain a steady course. Yet, there was a strange clarity in Thompson's mind. His training had kicked in. The crew had become a single unit, working in unison despite the fatigue, despite the overwhelming odds. It was almost as if the broken engine, in its own way, had forced the crew to work together like never before. "We've got this, lads. Stay focused. Stay sharp. We're almost home." Thompson's words cut through the storm, and the crew, though exhausted, nodded. The tension hadn't fully lifted, but now, for the first time since the attack, they were starting to feel a small sense of hope. But just as Thompson was beginning to feel the weight of the battle lifting, a sudden alert came through the radio. It was Allied command. "Lady Luck, this is Air Command. We have a fresh wave of German fighters inbound, moving at high speed. We recommend evasive action." "Not again," Thompson muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on the controls. More German fighters. He couldn't believe it. They had barely managed to fend off the first wave, and now, as if fate were determined to test them further, more enemy planes were on the way. "Captain, we're going to need backup. We can't outrun them with just 3 engines." Haskins looked at Thompson, his concern evident. "We've got to make it to base. We have no choice." Thompson's voice was resolute, though a part of him understood the gravity of the situation. They couldn't afford to engage with the enemy. They were already running on fumes. But there was no time to think about options. The only way out was through. The Mi-10-9s were already closing in, their engines roaring through the sky like predators sensing weakness. This time, the German fighters weren't hesitating. They had smelled blood. "Brace yourselves, men!" Thompson shouted as the plane suddenly banked to the left, trying to evade the incoming attack. The wind screamed past the damaged bomber, and the sounds of enemy aircraft grew louder. Closer. Lady Luck was straining under the pressure, its engines barely holding on as the fighters zeroed in. "We can't keep this up for long, Thompson," Haskins said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We're sitting ducks. The engine won't last much longer. And with the fuel nearly gone..." Thompson didn't need to hear the rest. The reality of their situation was staring him in the face. But there was something in him, something he hadn't quite recognized until this moment. He refused to give up. He refused to let his men fall into the hands of the enemy. "Hold tight, everyone. We're going to do this. We make it back no matter what." With the German fighters closing in, Thompson took a risk, pushing Lady Luck into a steep dive, trying to throw the attackers off their course. It was a move no one had expected from a B-17, especially one in its condition. But in that moment, with the engine struggling to maintain power, Thompson knew they had one last chance to survive, disrupt the enemy's rhythm. For a split second, the enemy fighters were forced to adjust. They hadn't anticipated such an unorthodox move. It wasn't a high-speed maneuver or a turn that was going to win the battle. It was the element of surprise, the unpredictability of a bomber that was supposed to be easy prey. The Mi-10-9s banked sharply, trying to realign, but it was enough to give the bomber a few moments of precious breathing room. The enemy fighters quickly regrouped, but it was already too late. Thompson could see the distant coastline of England now, just a few miles away, and he pushed the throttle to its last ounce of power. The bomber's engines strained, but they were holding up. His eyes locked onto the landing strip at RAF Northolt, where ground crews were already preparing for any incoming aircraft. "We're going to make it, men! We're almost there!" Thompson shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos as Lady Luck angled toward the runway. The German fighters gave chase, but the B-17, now on the final stretch, held steady. Thompson's eyes were fixed on the runway, and for a moment, everything around him faded away. It was just him, the plane, and the narrow line between life and death. With a final burst of determination, Lady Luck touched down on the runway, its wheels screeching against the tarmac as the crew exhaled in unison. They had made it. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the RAF ground crews rushed toward them, waving their arms in a mix of celebration and disbelief. They had seen many bombers return, but none like this. This was a bomber that had defied the odds, a crew that had fought for survival when all seemed lost. Thompson sat back in his seat, his hand still gripping the controls. His heart was pounding, but it was no longer from fear. It was from the pure, unrelenting adrenaline that had kept him alive, kept his men alive. They had done it. They had made it home. The roar of the engines had subsided, leaving only the sound of the wind against the fuselage of Lady Luck as it taxied to a halt on the runway at RAF Northolt. The crew sat in stunned silence, their bodies still tingling from the adrenaline, their minds unable to fully process what had just happened. They had barely made it back, but they were here, alive, and their bomber was still in one piece. As the ground crew ran toward the aircraft, their expressions a mix of disbelief and awe. Thompson felt his hands relax on the controls. He had done it. The crew had done it. Despite everything, despite the broken engine, despite the enemy fighters, despite the miles of hostile territory they had crossed, they had survived. "We're home, men." Thompson's voice broke the silence, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crew allowed themselves to breathe. They had made it. The journey that should have been a routine bombing raid had become one of the most dangerous, nail-biting experiences of their lives. But the relief was brief. As the crew stepped out of the B-17, the full weight of the situation started to sink in. They had been lucky, yes. But there were many others who hadn't been as fortunate. The RAF bomber squads were stretched thin, aircraft were being lost every day, and with Lady Luck returning, a sense of gratitude filled the air, along with a quiet, humble sense of survival. Over the next few hours, the crew went through the debriefing process. Flight Officer Thompson reported the details of the raid, the damage they had sustained, the German fighters they had encountered, and the strategy that had somehow kept them alive. But it wasn't until the RAF commander personally shook his hand that Thompson realized the true impact of their survival. "You've done more than survive, Officer Thompson. You've shown us that we're still in the fight no matter the odds." The commander's words were simple, but they carried weight. The airmen at RAF Northolt were facing one of the greatest challenges of the war, and though their numbers were dwindling, they had the courage to continue fighting. The crew of Lady Luck had reminded them of that. Meanwhile, as the mechanics began to inspect the B-17, they quickly discovered the full extent of the damage. The engine failure wasn't the only issue. The aircraft had been riddled with bullet holes from enemy fire, its tail section badly damaged, and several sections of the fuselage were dented from near misses. The fuel tanks had been nearly drained, and Thompson knew that, had they not managed to turn the plane around, there was a good chance they wouldn't have made it back at all. Yet, despite all the damage, the B-17 Flying Fortress had managed to keep flying. And that, the crew realized, was the true testament to the resilience of their aircraft. Lady Luck had absorbed punishment from enemy fire and still made it home. She had been built to endure, and that endurance had saved their lives. But there was something else. The crew's bond, their unwavering trust in one another, and their willingness to fight, despite the odds. This was more than just a story of survival. It was the embodiment of teamwork, leadership, and resilience under fire. They had done everything they could to keep their aircraft flying, and it was their instincts and quick thinking that had made the difference. They had fought together, and now they had to heal together. Days after the mission, the crew received a visit from the RAF's top brass, and for the first time, they were recognized for their bravery. They had not only survived against the odds, but they had returned with critical intelligence that would prove invaluable to the Allies in the weeks to come. Thompson and his crew became heroes of sorts. Their story passed around the base like a fable, a legendary tale of a bomber that had fought against overwhelming odds and survived to fight another day. But for Thompson, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about what they had learned. Nothing was certain in war, and the only way to win was to keep fighting, even when it seemed impossible. Back in the United States, as the war raged on, the story of Lady Luck's miraculous survival caught the attention of the American public. The Boeing B-17 had become a symbol of Allied strength, and stories of pilots and crews defying the odds were inspiring citizens to rally behind the war effort. Thompson's crew was featured in war bonds campaigns, newsreels, and stories shared across the radio waves. Their story was part of the broader narrative of American resilience in the face of adversity. However, beyond the public recognition, the crew's survival highlighted something critical to the Allied forces: resourcefulness in the air. The broken engine, while initially perceived as a death sentence, had actually forced the crew to adapt in ways they hadn't expected. The slowing speed, which would have been a major liability in most situations, gave the German fighters more difficulty in their pursuit. The damaged aircraft, though in desperate need of repairs, had proven that improvised tactics and instinct could overcome the loss of technological advantage. This concept of adaptability in warfare became a key takeaway. As the war progressed, the Allies understood that it wasn't just about having the best equipment or the most advanced technology. It was about how you used what you had, how you adapted to challenges, and how you relied on each other when it mattered most. Months after that harrowing mission, the crew of Lady Luck would return to the skies for more bombing raids over Nazi-occupied Europe. They would face new challenges, new enemies, and new risks. But the memory of that fateful day would never leave them. As the B-17 made its way across enemy lines again and again, it carried with it more than just ammunition and bombs. It carried the spirit of survival. It carried the legacy of a crew that, against all odds, had made it back. That legacy would inspire future generations of pilots, crew members, and soldiers who would face their own battles in the skies, on the ground, and at sea. For Jack Thompson, Bill Haskins, Hank Lawson, and the rest of the crew, their actions would never fade from the memory of those who witnessed them. Their story would continue to be told in the years after the war as an example of how teamwork, courage, and determination could overcome any obstacle. Lady Luck, the aircraft that had defied the odds and brought them home, would live on in aviation history as a symbol of what it means to survive against all odds. Even decades after the war, Lady Luck's legacy was preserved at aviation museums and in the minds of those who remembered the story of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the crew who had made it back when it seemed impossible.